Hello, this is Ahmed Name, and I will be presenting my solution to the data analyst interview Excel file/exercise. So as you can see on this tab, the instructions are provided alongside a few exercises slash questions. I will be going through them in order from first to last. They each deal with tabs that are in chronological order, essentially. Before I do get started, just want to mention that my solution to each of these exercises is in the purple tabs, and it also follows the exercises chronologically from first to last. Those tabs where you won't see a solution in a purple tab, that's because the solution was presented within the existing tab. So starting with the first exercise that deals with tabs 1 and 2. Question number 1, do some analysis on the quarterly income statement on tab 1. What trends do you see? What kinds of things stand out? So tab 1 did not look like this when the file was delivered to me. I added a few KPIs to help me assess what kind of trends exist. And the first thing that stands out is that sales for this specific company or corporation, whatever the case may be, are seasonal. So as you can see, in quarter 1 and in quarter 4, about 70% of the sales are accumulated. There's a drop off in Q2 and Q3, where the total between the two is 30%. So sales are obviously seasonal, mostly on the front end of the year and the back end of the fiscal year. Another trend that I noticed is the gross profit percentage is quite stable. So it varies from 87% to no more than 89%. This suggests that the cost of goods sold as a percentage of revenue, those are also stable and haven't really fluctuated by a great amount during the entirety of the year. Another thing that I noticed is expense categories are, for the most part, also quite stable. So your largest expense category, which is technology, went from, swung from between 31% and 37% throughout the year. But for the most part, if you go through each of these categories, you will notice that the variance between one quarter to the next as a percentage of revenue is not that great. This is true for all of the categories except for one that I noticed, and I bring this up because this category seems to be what is driving the fluctuation in the contribution margin. So as I stated earlier, gross profit percentage is stable, and yet when you look at the contribution margin as a percentage of revenue, you'll see that, for example, in Q2, it goes up to, or it peaks at 28%, whereas in Q4, it drops to 21%. Now, since the gross profit percentage is stable, the only category that can explain this fluctuation, contribution margin, would have to be the expense category. Now, with technology being the largest line item within the expense category, changes to that alone will impact the contribution margin percentage. And as you can see, between Q1 and Q2, the drop from 37% to 31% resulted in an increase of the contribution margin of 24% to 28%. Q2 on forward has sort of stabilized for technology. The driving force as to why the contribution margin decreased from Q2 onward from 28% to 21% is the other expenses item, which has doubled between Q1 to Q4, going from 5% of total revenue all the way to 10% of total revenue. So if you're trying to answer the question, why did contribution margin decrease to 21% in Q4, this right here is your answer. Other expenses is obviously sort of a vague category, so an additional investigation would be required to look at exactly what other expenses is and why it increased from 5% of total revenue to 10% of total revenue between Q1 and Q4. So that is the first question of the first part. Question 2, what types of issues might explain the change in yearly cash balances on tab 2 compared to the net income figures on the same tab? So here's tab 2. It's essentially a cash flow statement. You've got your net income, beginning of the year cash, end of the year cash, and here you have a calculation that essentially spits out your cash outflows or inflows throughout each year. We've got information here for 4 years. So before I begin to answer the question, it's important to sort of outline the difference that exists between net income and your cash balance for a given year. So net income is impacted by a few items that don't necessarily affect your cash balance and vice versa. For example, depreciation on an asset that you may have purchased, that will impact your net income. It'll be recognized as an expense on a yearly basis, whereas it will not impact your cash flow except on the onset when you actually purchased the asset and made the cash payment. So that's one example where the two differ. Another example of where net income and cash flow can vary is in the way that revenue is recognized. So traditionally, net income is sort of an accounting term, and it's calculated on an accrued basis, which essentially means that, for example, if you were to sign a contract for a service to be delivered or for a product to be sent out to a customer, you cannot recognize revenue for that service or for that product until you have rendered the service or delivered the product, regardless of when you received the cash. So if you sign a deal to render a service and you're paid upfront, that will impact your cash flow for that given year. But if you don't deliver that service until the following year, you can't recognize revenue until the year in which the service has been rendered. So having said all of that, let's just quickly go through this and do some analysis as to how the cash flow changed and how that may have impacted the net income for years 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I put this little sort of block together that essentially highlights the change in cash outflows and the change in net income for years 2, 3, and 4 relative to the prior year. So starting with year 2, cash outflows increased. So cash outflows in year 1 were about 7 million. Year 2, they were 11 million. So what you have here is a $4 million difference in cash outflows between years 2 and 1. Net income on the other hand, decreased. So net income for year one was 14 million. Net income for year two was 8 million. Now, these changes are sort of very intuitive. So essentially, you're spending more. For example, you could be spending more on operating expenses, and as a result, you're making less. So between years one and two, the change that occurs is sort of intuitive. It's very easy to explain. It's normal within the course of running an operation or running a business. Between year three, or sorry, rather year two and year three, this is when things get a little murky, and having that fundamental understanding of the difference between net income and cash is important when it comes to explaining why the numbers change in the way that they did. So as you can see, between year two and year three, your cash outflows decreased. What that means in simpler terms is that the company saw cash inflows of about $6 million. So you have more cash coming in, but net income for the company decreased significantly, going from positive 8 million to a deficit of 5 million. So someone looking at this may ask, how is it that the company saw cash inflows for the first time, and yet net income decreased significantly? Well, this has to do with the fact that the way net income and cash are calculated is different. So a potential scenario for why this could have been the case is that the company may have recorded a lot of sales that brought in a very healthy cash inflow, but those sales were made for services that weren't rendered until year four. So while they collected the cash in year three, they weren't able to recognize any of the revenue until year four. And this sort of leads me to the explanation for why the numbers are the way they are in year four. So when it comes to cash flow, especially cash flow, what happens in 1 year at the start of the year and at the end of the year will impact what happens in the following year. So assuming the scenario that I described for year three actually played out, the services weren't rendered until year four, all of a sudden you're going to see a huge boost in net income because all of these services or products that you sold in year three, when you collected the cash, were recognized as revenue from an accounting perspective in year four. And that's why you have a scenario where outflows increased and so did net income. So that answers the second part of the first exercise. Number three, the company's headcount costs have decreased while headcount has actually increased. What sort of factors might be causing this? Now, there are a number of factors that could have caused this. Before I get started, it's important to sort of lay out what the implication of the question is. So the implication is that the cost per head or per employee decreased significantly enough where the company was actually spending less overall on their headcount while also managing to increase the headcount within the corporation or the company. So this could have happened for a variety of reasons, and I'll go through them one at a time. So number one, flattening of the organization. So the company may have decided that it's a good idea to get rid of a small number of highly paid employees so managers or executives or what the case may be. And that small number of highly paid employees was then replaced by a greater number of lower level employees. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, the company may have improved its employee turnover or reduced it rather. So high turnover results in excess cost of organizations. This can come in the form of cost of recruitment, cost of selecting employees, the cost of training new employees. So if you're able to reduce employee turnover, you may end up in a situation where you're saving so much money that you're able to add in new employees while at the same time reducing your cost per employee or per head. Third reason is changes in the pay model. So companies oftentimes decide that it's a good idea to hire less full-time salaried employees and more contractors or commission-based employees. This way you're paying individuals for the hours that they put in, whereas for a full-time employee, they're essentially entitled to their 40 hours a week plus benefits such as healthcare, dental, retirement, and so on and so forth. Last reason is process improvement. So a lot of companies invest in automation and they make sure that they're always using up-to-date tools. This speeds up the work and it results in fewer man hours. And once again, the savings could be so significant that you could end up with a scenario where you're bringing on more people, but spending less overall as a company on your headcount. Moving on now to the marketing tabs. So number one, the marketing tab contains media results for two core products. There are a number of columns of data regarding the spending. One key metric is cost per lead. See what trends you uncover. So this is the first marketing tab. And this right here is sort of is my solution, or how I decided to lay out my findings. So the first thing I noticed is that the company has decided to allocate its resources essentially equally between the two products. So as you can see here, product two and product one, percentage as a total of the media cost is roughly 50-50. Percentage as a total of the leads generated is also roughly 50-50. And the cost per lead for both products is also quite similar. So you're looking at 28.5 for product two, 27.6 for product one. So again, just to sum up that point, resource allocation looks like it's equal for both products, and the resulting leads also look like they're equal for both products. Another trend that I noticed is that most of the media cost is incurred on weekends, Saturday and Sunday. So for both products, about 63% of the media cost, and again, 64% of the leads were generated on Saturday and Sunday. If you look at each product individually, you'll notice a similar pattern. So 61% here for product one, media cost, 62% of the leads generated. Same thing with product two, 64% of the media cost is on the weekends, and about 65% of the leads as well. So it seems that the organization is focusing its resources on media that's played on Saturday and on Sunday, as opposed to the remainder of the week, where about a third of the cost and a third of the leads are generated. Another trend that I noticed, and this will require additional information, but it's the sort of thing that's worth mentioning. So I noticed that the cost per lead has sort of increased between week 29 and week 34. So there's a bit of bouncing around, but if you look at week 29, for both products, the average is $26.91 per lead, whereas in week 34, that number has jumped above 30. So like I said, additional information would be required to actually see whether this is a trend. Potentially looking at historical information would also be useful. This could be a trend that occurs on a yearly basis, where as you approach later parts of the year, advertising or media costs tend to go up naturally. But I thought it's a point that's worth mentioning. And once again, this trend exists for both products, more so for product one, where the increase is from 25.71 to above $30. Less so for product two, where the increase is far less significant, going from 28.8 in week 29 to above 30 in week 34. Last but not least is how the media costs are allocated amongst the various markets. So as is shown here, over 90% of the media costs for both products combined is spent on national cable. That 90% investment results in roughly 93% of the leads generated. So if you're looking at the driving factor of essentially everything we looked at above, as to why the cost per lead is the way it is, as to why spending is allocated on given days the way it is, looking at national cable will be your answer, just because it weighs so much more than anything else, essentially. And these ratios exist for both products. So if you look at product one, you're looking at a 92% of the media cost is attributed to national cable, roughly 94% of the leads. Product two, same thing, 89.4% of the media cost, 92% of the leads as well are the result of national cable. Now, looking at the remaining markets and how well they've done is also important, because while spending for these remaining markets is far less than national cable, there are areas where you could potentially find efficiencies, essentially where it would make sense to invest more because of the numbers that exist so far. So the cost per lead is an important ratio, but I would suggest another ratio that's also quite important, and that is what I would call the efficiency ratio, that compares the media cost as a percentage of total media cost spending for each market, compared with leads as a percentage of total leads for each market. So for example, if you look at New York, 2% of the media cost, 2.03%, were allocated to the New York market, and that resulted in 2.09% of the leads. So if the percentage of the leads generated is greater than the percentage of the media costs incurred, you're looking at a market that is relatively efficient. On the other hand, if you look at Boston, for example, where 0.67% of the media cost was allocated, only 0.48% of the leads were the result of that allocation. So this is a market that's not necessarily as efficient as New York. It's not necessarily as efficient as national cable, where the percentage of leads generated is greater than the percentage of the media costs. Moving on now, Marketing tab 2 contains order data for a couple of products. See what trends you see. So this is the Marketing 2 tab. You've got a couple of dates. You got your opt-in date, your order date, call center, status, number of orders, sales or revenue. I've added these additional columns for the case of doing my analysis. So number one is the opt-in month. So when I was creating some of the charts that I'll display later, it can get a little cramped if you're using order day as the, or opt-in day as the axis. So I opted to look at the numbers holistically on a month-by-month basis. So this is just a formula I put together to extract the opt-in month as well as the order month. And here is how I've decided to lay out my solution. And one of the first things that I noticed, first of all, product 3 brings in sort of the bulk of the sales. So you're looking at 43.4% of the sales, resulting from 46.3% of the orders. Product 2 is second with 37.9% of the sales, 28.35% of the orders. Again, this goes back to the efficiency conversation that I had earlier. A product that's bringing you almost 40% of the sales as a result of less than 30% of the orders is a lot more efficient than a product that brings in 18, 19% of the sales as a result of 25% of the orders. That efficiency is another way of saying that your price per order for product 2 is a lot higher than your price per order for product 1. So, I mean, you need additional information to sort of make this point definitively, but ideally you would be allocating resources and investing in trying to sell more of product 2, just because each order generates more revenue for you and will essentially help your bottom line. Moving on now, so I plotted sales and orders for each product against the opt-in month, and a trend is quite visible. So all 3 products follow a similar pattern. They all peak in months 7, 8, and 9 based on the opt-in month. Another trend that I uncovered is that the price per order remains stable for all 3 products throughout the months in which they were sold. And last but not least is I looked at sales and I looked at orders per call center, and it's very clear that call centers 2 and 3 account for most of the sales generated. So for all 3 products, they account for 85% of the sales. If you look at each product individually, you'll notice a similar pattern. So product 1, 89% of the sales. Product 2, 80% of the sales. And last but not least, product 3, 86% of the sales. So call centers 2 and 3 seem to be doing most of the heavy lifting. Moving on now to the rep tabs. So compare the two tabs, to see if where there are changes to what's being reported and if there are any other discrepancies that you find. So here are the two rep tabs, and essentially information was pulled in the AM. It was pulled again in the PM because of some issues or discrepancies that came about. And the point of the exercise is to sort of outline what those changes were. So the first thing I did was I pivoted both of these tables. So here's your pivot table for the PM. And the reason that I pivoted them is that you can sort of have a consolidated view of what the data actually is and what it shows. Here is the pivot for the AM. And before you get started with something like this, a measure of data discovery is required. So something as basic as determining whether the campaigns that existed in the AM also exist in the PM, just to make sure additional campaigns weren't included. So a basic count, you're looking at 115 campaigns in the PM. You look at the AM, you got 115 again. So the campaigns are essentially the same. It's just a matter of figuring out where the discrepancies are. So this is your AM pivot. And next to the AM pivot is where I set up a series of columns that looked at the difference between the AM figures and the PM figures. So I used VLOOKUPs using the campaign as sort of the primary key to extract the PM information. So whereas here you have your AM visitors, leads, day 1 orders, day 2 orders, day 3 orders. Here you have your PM visitors, PM leads, PM day 1 orders, PM day 2 orders, and so on and so forth. And in between each of the columns, I added a diff column that looks at the difference between your PM and your AM for each of the columns outlined. Now, what I did was I took this new series of columns that I created that looked at the difference, and I moved it over to a new tab, just so it's easier on the eyes, essentially. And once you've gotten to this point, you can go through each of the columns and essentially determine where the differences exist and to what extent they exist. So we're going to start with day 3 orders and make our way all the way to visitors and look at where the discrepancies are and sort of pinpoint them. And from that point, you can sort of try and investigate why they exist and what solutions can be implemented to avoid having to deal with this issue again. So for this exercise, what I'll do is I'll basically sort the difference columns just to see where the largest differences exist. So starting with day 3 orders, I'm going to sort the column from largest to smallest. There's a total column here. We'll just sort of get rid of that for the sake of this exercise. So sort from largest to smallest. And you'll see there are a few campaigns here where there is a difference. Campaign 52, you're looking at a 121 order difference between the PM and the AM. Campaign 53, 41, 105, and so on and so forth. These are not differences that I would describe as material. They're possibly worth highlighting just so you can maybe try to understand why they occurred. But in the grand scheme of things, I wouldn't call them material. As you can see, for the rest of the campaigns, there aren't any differences aside from campaign 82, where there's a difference of 11 essentially. Move on to day 2. Sort from smallest to largest. Sort again from largest to smallest. As you can see, day 2 orders between the PM and the AM did not change. They're essentially identical for each and every single campaign. Day 1. So let's start by sorting from largest to smallest. Campaign 105, as you can see, there's a difference in day 1 orders between PM and AM of 392. PM orders were 574, which suggests that AM orders were about 100 and change. That to me is a material difference. So I would definitely point that out. I would highlight the campaign, and I would make sure that that information, the discrepancy, is passed on and dealt with accordingly. The rest of the campaigns, no material differences that I can see. 21 here, 14, 7. Nothing of particular significance. Moving on now to leads. So right away, so these different columns are, they have conditional formatting where if the difference is greater than 0 or less than 0, it's highlighted in red. And unlike the other columns we've looked at, here you can see a lot of red. So right off the bat, it's quite clear that there are quite a number of differences. And if you quickly scroll through from top to bottom, you'll notice that the differences are all positive differences. So the PM seems to be greater as far as leads than the AM for quite a number of campaigns. So let's sort from largest to smallest, and right off the bat, there are a number of campaigns where the difference is what I would call material. You're looking at a 35,000 lead difference for campaign 52. You're looking at a nearly 18,000 lead difference for campaign 34, and so on and so forth. This is definitely problematic. I mean, if there's a 35,000 difference for campaign 52, it suggests that the AM figure was about 3,000, whereas the PM figure is nearly 39,000. So those are differences that are definitely worth pointing out. They're definitely worth highlighting. They're definitely worth investigating. The variance is quite large. Yeah, especially for these ones up here. Again, this is the benefit of sorting from largest to smallest, is you will get the difference in absolute terms from largest to smallest. Another approach of going about this is you can look at the percentage difference. That would also help with the analysis and would go a long way in uncovering issues that may exist. So now that we've uncovered all of these problems with the leads, let's move on to visitors. So I'm going to sort from largest to smallest. There are differences, but they don't seem to be significant. Let's try smallest to largest. So these are a couple of interesting campaigns. So it looks like there was a visitor value for campaigns 66 and 69 in the AM. However, in the PM, there was an error, which implies that there were no visitor values recorded. There weren't recorded as either a positive number, a negative number, or even as 0. They just didn't show up. So while the difference may not be significant, I would investigate to see why there was an error. because while the difference may have been small, this could point to a larger issue that may exist with the way that the data is collected. And it's important to investigate those issues, because if they go unnoticed, they may result in potential problems in the future as data is continuously pulled. Moving on now to the ship tabs. The Ship 1 tab has shipment data for a large number of packages. Ship 2 has shipping rates by zone and weight for 3 different carriers. We need to calculate the shipping cost, which is dependent on the zone and weight. In addition, certain carriers are used for certain weight ranges as below. Calculate the total shipping cost for these packages. So this is the sheet that essentially the master sheet that provides the shipping rate per carrier depending on both the zone and the weight of the shipment. So the weights range from 1, or I guess from 0 all the way up to 50 pounds. This right here is important. Weight not to exceed these amounts. So for example, if you've got a shipment that's 4.9 pounds in zone 3, you would have to look at the weight 5 column, and you would then look at zone 3, and your rate would be 7.24, assuming that the carrier is UPS. Now, moving on to my solution. So the first thing I did was to try and figure out which carrier would be appropriate for each of these line items based on the information that we were provided in the instructions tab. So this right here. So let's just copy that over. So these are the rules by which I designed my if statement. So if C, which is the weight, is greater than 24, you want FedEx. If it's less than 15, you want USPS. Otherwise, and based on the logic I had already provided, otherwise implies between 15 and 24, you want UPS. So just to do a little validation, let's take out, here are a couple of figures above 24. You've got FedEx. Let's look at a couple that are between 15 and 24. So 16. You've got UPS. And let's look at a few that are less than 15. And what you get is USPS. Now, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, this right here is important. Weight not to exceed these whole number amounts. So the second step I had to implement was I had to round up these weights for the sake of the formulas I was going to use to essentially extract the rate information depending on the carrier. So I rounded up each of these amounts. So while this shipment is 0.03 pounds, it would fall under the 1 pound category. And for that reason, I had to round up each and every single weight. So if you go all the way down, 31.56 went to 32, 25.36 went to 26, and so on and so forth. This column right here, column F, is a column I put together, again, for the sake of using a formula to pull in the appropriate rate figures. So if you look here, the terminology that's used is zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, so on and so forth. Whereas here, the zone was listed as simply a number going from 1 to 7 or 8. So I put together a column that essentially reformatted column B and provided me with the values that I would need to be able to extract the appropriate shipping rates for the appropriate carrier. Last but not least, the formula that sort of brought it all together. This formula is a little messy. It's essentially a nested F statement that also includes a VLOOKUP, which also includes a match formula. It includes 3 parts. What it essentially says is if D2, which is, if column D, which specifies what the carrier is UPS, then we're interested in essentially doing a VLOOKUP based on the weight and zone of this block right here that falls under UPS. Moving on, if as opposed to UPS it's FedEx, then we're going to look at the FedEx block. And if it's not FedEx, if it's USPS, then we're going to be looking at the USPS block. So it was a bit of a long formula. As I said, it required using nested if statements, VLOOKUPs, match. It's really important to validate your information once you've established formulas of this length. So just quickly, let's just pick out a couple of random numbers. Let's make sure they're in different weight categories. So here are 2. So if you look at this line, you've got zone 4, you've got a weight of 6, and your carrier is USPS. So weight of 6, zone 4, USPS 4.87, 4.87. Let's look at this line now. You've got a zone 8 weight rounded off to 26, and your carrier is FedEx because the weight exceeds 24. So you got 26, FedEx. What was the zone again? Zone 8. So right here, you're looking at 38.55, 38.55. So this column J, provides you with the appropriate shipping rate. Column K provides you with a total. Now, the total column may look like it's producing the same results as the combined column, but what I noticed is there are certain line items where the P count, which I assume is short for parcel count, is either 2 or 3. So in those scenarios, what I did was I took the shipping rate and I multiplied it by the number of parcels. So here, for example, you've got a rate of 5.43, but your total is double that amount because you've got 2 parcels. And same thing goes for lines where the parcel count is 3. So that's my solution. And this is essentially the total of column K, and you're looking at a total of, let's just reformat this so it's easier to see. You're looking at a total of $79,239. Moving on now to the final exercise, channel sales tab. So these are the yellow tabs. So the channel sales tab includes channel sales order amounts by week, essentially. So the first thing I did, and I had mentioned why I did this earlier for a prior exercise, but to sort of make things nice and tidy, I extracted the week number from the date that was provided. So for example, our starting point would be week 2 because January 6th, 2013 falls into week 2 of that year. Our numbers go all the way up to week 40. So you're looking at data from weeks 2, 2013 to weeks 40 of 2013. So we're first asked to, or I was first asked to run some correlation regression analysis to see if there are any patterns that exist for each of the channels. So I completed my regression analysis in this tab. So right off the bat, before I get into the formula that I use or the line of best fit, if you go through each of these channels, it's very clear that they follow a very similar pattern as far as how they sell. Now, channels 1 and 2, if you look at the y-axis here, sell much more than channels 3 and 4. But the pattern that exists for each of them is very similar. In fact, if you look at orders placed between weeks 16 and weeks 24 for each of the channels, those weeks account for between 45 and 53% of the sales for each channel. So the pattern that exists for all 4 channels is essentially quite similar. Now, what I did next was I ran a regression analysis using a line of best fit. And here it is, it's the red dots. Now, a good measure of the extent to which your line of best fit is appropriate is your R value. So as a whole, for all 4 channels, we've got a 0.86 R value, which is great. As your R value approaches 1, it implies a greater correlation between your information and your line of best fit. So a 0.85 is actually quite strong. If you look at the R value for each channel, so you've got a 0.83 for channel 1, which is strong, 0.87 for channel 2, again, very strong, 0.92 for channel 3, which is again extremely strong, and 0.92 for channel 4, which tells the same story. You've got a line of best fit that's essentially a good measure of the pattern of sales for each of the 4 channels. Now, what I was asked to do next is forecast out the next 12 weeks based on a couple of assumptions. So the first assumption is that for the first week of the forecast for the next 12 weeks for channel 1 in particular, we are to assume that that week matches the most recent 6-week average of channel 1's order count, and that thereafter, the volume is to increase by 4% week over week. The second assumption is that order estimates for the remaining 3 channels, so channels 2, 3, and 4, should be based on whatever patterns we uncover in part 1. Part 1 was the channel regression that I just went through and described. If we don't decide to use the patterns uncovered in this in part one, we're asked to explain why. So to start off, channel one, what I did here is I made week 41, or so these are the remaining 12 weeks of the year essentially. The first of which is an average of the 6 prior weeks of data. So all I did here was take an average of essentially weeks 34 to 40, and thereafter I increased that amount by 4% week over week. So figuring out the forecast for channel one was pretty straightforward. Now channels 2, 3, and 4, we were asked to use patterns uncovered in the channel regression to come up with the forecast. I did not use the patterns uncovered in part one for the following reasons. Number one, historical data doesn't exist for weeks 40 to 52 for channels 2, 3, and 4. And what that essentially implies is that figuring out the seasonality for those weeks is extremely difficult. To be able to do that without historical data, you would need additional product or channel knowledge, essentially additional context, which I don't have, which may lead you to ask, why not use the line of best fit to sort of forecast out the next 12 weeks. Now, the problem with using the line of best fit is that this formula for all 4 channels, channels 2, 3, and 4 in particular, was calculated only using 39 weeks of data. So using the formula to forecast weeks that weren't used to construct the formula in the first place wouldn't produce sound results. What the formula would be useful for is, for example, if you're looking at 2014 and you want to forecast what you may sell in weeks 2 through 40, that will provide you with numbers that are more sound. Using the formula to forecast out the next 12 weeks, that will not produce the kinds of results that you could be comfortable with. So how did I forecast out channels 2, 3, and 4? I essentially used the exact same method that was used for channel 1. Based on the information that I have, as I said on the onset of this exercise, all 4 channels follow a very similar sales trend. Here it is again. So if we are to assume that week 1 of the forecast is the average of the 6 prior weeks for channel 1, and if we are to assume a 4% growth thereafter, it's reasonable to infer that channels 2, 3, and 4 would follow a similar pattern. And that's exactly what I did. So I took the average of the prior 6 weeks for week 1 of the forecast, and I increased the numbers by 4% thereafter. Now, to come up with a more appropriate solution, additional information would obviously need to be provided. There would have to be an explanation as to why we were to assume in the first place a 4% growth week over week. For example, if you were to change that growth from 4% to 6% for channel 2, the numbers would change accordingly, and they would begin to follow a different pattern. Overall, based on the information that was provided, I felt that the method used for channel 1 should be applied for channels 2, 3, and 4 to construct a 12-week forecast. I think that does it for the exercises. Yep. So I appreciate the opportunity. If you do have any questions about any of my solutions, feel free to reach out to me. I will be sending over the source Excel document alongside a Word document that sort of explains my reasoning for why I answered the questions and exercises the way that I did. Thank you for taking the time, and we will be in touch.